Hi there. Welcome to the EPRC Podcast. As mentioned in the bio, we're here with the amazing Sam Tullman, EPRC member and a really, really dear friend of mine. We're really proud to have him as part of the EPRC, and he's doing really incredible research. So now that we've given his background, Sam, do you want to just start by talking about like your own background and sort of how you got involved with spirituality and meditation?
Yeah, absolutely. So the story has many potential lengths. I'll give like a kind of high level story, but going back to maybe the first. I think in a way the seed was planted when I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at age 8. And you know, for those who don't know about that condition, it has a lot of different elements. It's a little bit different than type 2 diabetes, which is more common, we hear more about. But basically type 1 diabetes involves inevitably blood sugars that are constantly going up and down, even if you're doing a quote-unquote great job of managing. And so there's lots of physiological change always happening all the time, and naturally that gets reflected in what's going on in your mind. And so from a relatively early age, I think I was really struck by the fact of like, wow, when my blood sugars are high, this is what's happening for me, and it's one thing. And when they're low, here's a dramatically different thing that's happening for me. So, you know, in a kind of, from a Buddhist lens, we would say like this is an initial exposure to impermanence. And of course, there's lots of suffering to go along with it, which is great. So that was kind of an initial exposure, and then also this sense of like, you know, sometimes my intentions don't line up with what I actually do, which, you know, all of us know in our lives, and you know, certainly people with diabetes know that as well, in terms of treatment decisions. So I was like, this mind might not be as mine as I think it is. And I wouldn't have phrased it that way back then, but I think there was the beginning of, you know, some seeds of insight perhaps, which then got watered by more difficulties, as you know, that's what tends to water insight in everyday life, I think. So there were some pretty difficult things going on in my household growing up. I had a sibling who was really struggling with drug addiction, which manifested in some very outward and kind of scary ways for a kid, which I was, and it was scary for my mom as well. And she was dealing with her trauma around that. So it was a pretty difficult place to be at various moments. And I think also seeing people's behavior, I was like, why do we act this way? Like, why do we human beings act this way? So that kind of began a psychological and I would say also meditative inquiry. So kind of both the scientific third-person lens and the first-person lens. I read Siddhartha, the book, around that time, and I was like very fascinated by it. I was interested in Buddhism. I had no exposure, no idea of, you know, how do I learn more about this or practice more. And so I kind of started doing like ascetic practices on my own, try to expose myself to a lot of pain and see what happened to me and try to withstand it, things like that. And naturally that fell off and was, you know, it wasn't a self-harming thing. It was truly out of an idea to understand what was happening with my mind and to practice. I just had no idea how to practice. So that fell off. In high school, unlike most people, my life actually got good. So I kind of forgot about this whole mind thing, and came back to it when I was in college and again struggling, and I won't get into that just for time purposes, but was really going through a difficult time and was quite depressed, and somebody recommended that I start a meditation practice. And I was kind of doing it under the context of being a better collegiate football player, which is pretty funny. As soon as I started practicing, it felt like coming home. It felt like this thing that I was remembering rather than learning for the first time. I was like, oh, right, this is what's most important. And quickly that was reflected in my life, and it was the most important thing in my life.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I have so many things that I'd like to ask, just even starting from the beginning of the story with the diabetes, which is such a difficult diagnosis as a kid. And then also this idea, the idea of the highs and the lows. And did you find that the highs and lows of your blood sugar was mirrored in your mind, so that did you feel that you felt more depressed when you were having a low, and did those feel like sort of the spiritual highs and lows that you experience as well?
Absolutely. So I wouldn't say it maps on so much to high and low emotionally. Actually, it kind of sucks on both ends.
Yeah.
So the high, if it's anything, is being right in the middle, and I think there's something very actually profound about that maybe we don't recognize as people with diabetes. But absolutely, I think that was the observation, right? It's like the changes that were going on in my mind when blood sugars changed. So, for example, and changed to this day. So high blood sugar, and sometimes it feels different too, that you can't even categorize it really, but often a common perception that I have and other people have is you feel kind of sluggish, it's a little more difficult to think, a little more foggy, and also, if it's sustained for a little while, it can be quite irritable in that state. And so those are kind of the observations of just a high period. And then there's lows, and lows are kind of a different thing. You've got a lot of adrenaline pumping. Sometimes it feels like energy. I often actually get really hyper. I can be pretty silly when my blood sugar starts to get low, which, I'll say I enjoy it. I would never do it on purpose, but I'm going to enjoy it if I'm feeling goofy. And I often make other people laugh that way too.
Awesome.
So then there's that. And then there's, if your blood sugar is high and it drops really fast, and especially if it drops to a low, that drop physiologically causes like a dramatic decrease in heart rate and blood pressure. And so that actually feels very depressing. And so I remember one particular moment a couple of years ago where I was blood sugar was dropping rapidly, and I was just overwhelmed with what I perceived to be deep depression, but it was momentary, right? And it came on so fast. I probably was in a bad mood to start with, but the depth of it was dramatic. And also resolved rather than over weeks, over a few minutes.
Yeah, it really speaks. I deal with hypoglycemia. I'm not diagnosed with diabetes, but the low blood sugar, I can so feel that sort of that low that happens, but then you're able to step out of it, which I think is so useful, because I was also diagnosed with major depressive disorder, and yeah, it's getting to see that you can get out of that state that's so important. And that's why I think it's so cool. I have a similar interest in the brain, and you looking at what is happening in the brain when we meditate, and how Dr. Daniel Ingram at the EPRC has had his brain scanned, and he can move from different levels and states, and just how that shows how powerful our brains are. And so that really speaks to me when you're talking about how you got so interested in the brain and how it works. And so would you say that it's useful for people suffering from depression, then meditation practice, and is that sort of how you sort of dealt with your own?
So I'm obviously I'll give a response not as a doctor or medical professional. Yes, I think it is useful, and there's actually research to back that up. So I can say also, as somebody who's kind of speaking from a literature-informed place, yes, I think we do know that it's helpful. Doesn't mean it's like a replacement in every case for any other treatment that you might be getting. And actually, sometimes people think of medications. First of all, I know I have a number of friends, fellow meditators, who both take medications for depression or bipolar disorder, and also have a deep meditation practice. And it's the combination of the two that can be so effective. And similarly, I know I personally have benefited from not only deep meditation, but also engaging in therapy.
Yeah.
And so I think, combinations can be very effective. Doing this meditative work, especially when it's orienting you towards what's happening moment to moment in your body, I think can only be helpful for these treatments. And it can only be helpful for unhooking yourself from your behavioral, emotional patterns that all of us have.
Yeah, like individually, and then at the same time, it sort of helps with sort of this, has like a pro-social effect because it like changes how we relate to others, and that it changes how we understand ourselves too, right? Like, and would you say it kind of like shifts your understanding of yourself as this single separate entity to like an understanding of this sort of interconnected oneness? Is that how you found it at all?
Yeah, so certainly those experiences happen. And I think it's interesting, like when you talk about this profound interconnected oneness, I think that's amazing. And I wish for everybody to have experiences that point to that. Yeah. And the reality of integrating that, it feels a little different. Or, it doesn't feel like you're walking around at the peak of a psychedelic trip all of the time.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be very functional.
No.
And so it's like, wow, what do you do, like, having experienced that? How do you come back? And, much of it, ideally, is not for you to cognitively decide, but it starts to get integrated, especially when those are places that you revisit frequently, and it becomes a little bit easier to let go of stuff that's not important. Yeah. Or to redirect yourself to what is important if you're getting distracted from it, for example. Also, along the way, going to these oneness experiences, I want to say, I know this is a big part of Daniel's work, which has been hugely influential in my life, is you uncover a lot of uncomfortable places. You happen upon some pretty painful places. And so that's important too. A second ago we were talking about depression. And it's important to know too, what I said a second ago was, yeah, it could only be helpful. And the reality, I think that's true. And you will inevitably, as your practice deepens in meditative or emergent practices, you will encounter some unsavory places.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like the blood sugar, they're the highs and lows, and those lows are actually not with diabetes, but with the spirituality, so essential to our growth, our spiritual growth, and yeah, like learning to be in those and to learn from it versus like the despair that can sometimes happen. So yeah, and so important because with the sort of increasing popularity of mindfulness and all of these emergent practices like yoga. And there is sort of, the sort of tendency to just say it's all good and this is going to change the world, but at the same time we just have to be so aware of sort of the negative aspects and how really difficult things can arise as a result of it. So is that part of, so you're doing some amazing research, you're also a Fulbright scholar, so when you're sort of working with patients, if you don't mind giving us sort of a background of the research you're doing and with participants, have they experienced both the highs and the lows, and how do you sort of help them if they're going through a difficult experience and reaction?
Yeah. Okay. I'm hearing kind of two questions in there. So I will say, like, first, with the research that I do, that's not inherently baked in, although certainly I have witnessed people going through difficult moments as a result of these emergent practices. So there's that. I would say more that's actually something I observe in my the Sangha, the meditation community that I'm a part of, as well as the one that's specific for diabetes, which I co-founded, to see people going through different stages and experiences. It's actually so helpful. Yeah. It's helpful for that person, ideally, as long as they don't get too caught up in, well, am I in this stage or that stage, and what's happening next. That can be very distracting. But it's also helpful as somebody else in community with people. I think that also, like, that might even be more important, is to know, like, here's some people that are, like, pushing themselves through a cycle that's going to have deep implications for the way that they might interact with me. And so sometimes they might interact in ways that are not very pleasant, and other times it's going to seem like they're almost an entirely different person because they're so happy-go-lucky. I think that's very useful to know when you're in community with others. As far as my research goes, so the research that I did for my Fulbright Scholarship in Brazil was a phase 1 clinical trial of NN-DMT. So that's a classic psychedelic, and probably a lot of people, if you don't know what DMT is, you might have heard of ayahuasca, and DMT is one of the chemicals. There's a number, but it's one of the chemicals that occurs naturally in plants that are used in ayahuasca, as well as some other kind of roots in plants that are indigenous to Brazil and other parts of the world. So essentially what the clinical trial was for, phase 1 is primarily like safety and kind of initial efficacy or let's say like potency of the substance. And really ultimately what that project is working towards is a treatment for treatment-resistant depression, and eventually perhaps partially treatment-resistant depression or just depression in general. One of the interesting things about kind of our route of administration or our study was the route of administration, because what we know of a lot of psychedelics now is perhaps psilocybin, which is 4 to 6 hours for an experience, or LSD, which is closer to 12 hours if you're lucky of an experience. Whereas DMT, the experience comes and goes within about 15 minutes, the acute kind of majorly altered experience, if you're inhaling it. And so that's the route of administration is kind of important and interesting there, doing a psychedelic trial with an inhaled substance that can leave your body pretty quickly. It's better for everybody, right? Because it's a lot to commit to a full day of therapy. It's a lot for therapists to commit to that. It's not really a scalable model. And so it's quite interesting to look at something that can be done a little more efficiently.
Definitely. And so do you, is this sort of your research very interdisciplinary in a sense too then? So looking at like sort of multiple ways to help people with depression, and so looking at the scientific side, spiritual side. You're also, you have a neuroscience degree as well, and really interested in psychology too, right? So yeah, how do you find that, like, why is the interdisciplinary approach so like necessary and helpful, do you think?
Yeah, I think the interdisciplinary approach is so important because each discipline, each area brings a different lens. Yeah. And there's certain things when you put a certain lens on, you can only see that thing. And so you take that as truth. I mean, it's like the classic story of, I'm sure everybody has heard of it, I shudder even to mention this platitude, but of people who are blindfolded or might perhaps be blind and they're feeling an elephant. And one person says, oh, it's like this, and they're describing the tail. And another person's like, oh, it's like this, they're describing the leg. And so I think that's how each of the lenses work. And because we're human beings and we have amazing but also quite limited minds, we need these lenses. These lenses are actually a way for us to focus what we're looking at. And so it's wonderful. We put on this lens of neuroscience, and I put on my kind of harder core, more materialist point of view, and I'm like, okay, here are the things that I can make out here. And it's very useful. That's actionable information. But if I think that that's the full truth, then I've kind of missed the fact that I'm only looking at the trunk of the elephant. It's a very important part, and we need that trunk to have an idea of what's going on there. But then to be able to take that lens off, which I think is also the core of, certainly of Zen practice, to be able to take that lens off and put another lens on, which can show me something different. Oh, wow, I never saw it from that perspective. So, for example, in a study perspective, you might have the neuroscience lens say, okay, we need this data at this time in order to prove these kinds of things. And then you might have the therapist on the study who's more focused about the experience of their patient or client, and they might say, yeah, but that's going to totally mess up that person's experience to be measuring their brain in these ways at this time. They're in a vulnerable emotional state, and you know what it means to mess up their experience? It means you're going to get bad results. And so we have to be able to put on that lens, take that off, and there's so many. I think we can only benefit from having more of these lenses, and lenses we don't think are even related. That's often where the coolest stuff comes out.
So true. Yeah, is that sort of partially why you're interested in the EPRC, just that sort of multidisciplinary approach? I think we're at 200 plus researchers now, people from all around the world, and yeah, just working in neuroscience and literature and psychology and psychiatry. And so yeah, is that kind of how you got attracted to it, and how were you ultimately introduced to it? And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's been really appealing and exciting for me, is to meet people that have all sorts of different kinds of expertises and lenses and inputs into their own kind of mind-body phenomenon. And it's like, whoa, I want to know some about that input, and I want to take it into here. So yes, I think that's really appealing. My initial exposure to the EPRC, I would probably just say, is through reading Daniel's book, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. It was hugely influential in my own meditation practice. It continues to be.
It's just
there it is on the shelf. I was like, what's happening?
what you pointing
at? So, yes, his book has been hugely influential and in my life, and I've shared it with a number of people. Like, oh, if you're really wanting to take a deep dive into meditation, and you really want to understand some of the workings and foundations, this is where to go, which I still hold to be true. I think I actually, literally just yesterday, I sent somebody that book. And that actually ended up playing out with somebody I was formerly working with, and he basically was like, hey, I think Daniel might be a really interesting person to collaborate with for what we're doing. And so the three of us ended up having a conversation. I had never reached out to Daniel after reading the book. But we had a conversation, and it seemed like a fit, and I was excited to participate in any EPRC related things. So
amazing. Yeah, he's such a good connector. I don't know if you've heard his podcast episode. It's on synchronicity. I forget the name of the podcast, but it's so interesting in how just even the creation of the EPRC, just like a number of instances of synchronicity with these people connecting to other people, and it all feels quite beautiful and inspiring. Like, I really excited to talk more about the research you're doing and how it really does relate to the work we're doing. I'm curious, have you had your own emergent experiences, given that you meditate, and any ones that you want to share?
They're all so wonderful, and they're all not to be missed. And I think like the best thing, so there's lots of highs and lows, and it's about where it leaves you, I think. But there's certainly like more fantastical stories that probably make better podcast material. So certainly like various cathartic experiences with psychedelics, and I remember like probably the first time, certainly at least since I was a young child, that I felt like I truly felt unconditional love, was the first time that I took LSD. And that's not a regular habit of mine, but I was fortunate to be doing that with somebody who was very experienced, and he had brought some LSD, and we kind of made a ceremony out of it, and totally unexpectedly, that was kind of an experience that I happened on. It was a kind of beautiful visual experience as well, which I won't go into, but what I think was most important and lasting about that was having this experience of love, unbounded love that had nothing to do with me, but applied to me also, or was being felt by me or experienced by me, I would say. And that, so then, that's like, how do you integrate that? I don't even know what to do with that. It was great. And the natural inclination to say, let's go back and do more of that. And I think that is quite natural, and perhaps it can be useful to go back and do some, but much more profound was maybe a year or two later, feeling that with a person, and having a person who was like a sister to me. At some point, basically, I was tired and not feeling well, and she was taking care of me. She just gave me a hug, and I was almost brought to tears by just like, oh, that's that feeling, and you don't need to be on anything or be having such an altered experience to know what love is.
Yeah.
So that's profound. Certainly, all of the DMT experiences are fun and weird and interesting. There was one, my first time in an ayahuasca ceremony, basically spent an unknown amount of time. It felt like hours, just repeatedly experiencing myself be killed in different ways, which sounds like the workings of a bad trip.
It does.
When you think of a bad trip, that sounds like it. And I was kind of like, wow, that's intense. I wasn't letting it get to me too much. Fortunately, I already had some meditation practice to lean on and say, okay, this is what's happening in my mind. Let's keep going. But that was quite an experience, and certainly that first experience was harrowing in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then on the meditation end, the things that are, I think, interesting to report are the jhana experiences, which I know Daniel talks about a lot as well. And I'm no expert in jhana practice, but especially on retreat, having the opportunity to dive deep into some of the kind of formless jhanas and be like, whoa, what in the F was that? That was crazy and cool and amazing. Actually, often it doesn't even feel like that when you come out of it, but looking back on it now, that's kind of my reaction. I remember actually the first time that I had an experience with one of the jhanas that's sometimes called boundless space wasn't actually in a retreat circumstance. It was just, I was guiding meditation for a sitting group that I was working with at that time. And I was guiding a meditation on loving kindness, and I happened to be sitting next to my girlfriend, who's still my girlfriend, and we're quite close, and I love her a lot. And I was beginning to do this metta practice, kind of visualizing her, and this love for her came up. And it was such a deep pull that it was like a vortex, and I instantly got pulled into this like wide open, like words don't begin to even describe it. It was like the kind of thing like my jaw wants to drop now thinking about it. And I've never had an experience like that as deep in that jhana ever, even on a retreat. That was a one-time experience. And the funny thing was I was there and I was like, and then I still had to keep guiding meditation, which, classically you're not supposed to be able to even talk in such a state, but some part of my mind was like, yeah, but there's people that are waiting for you to say the next thing. So that was quite a weird and interesting one.
It's so beautiful. Yeah, and I remember I was listening to one of your podcast episodes, and you were talking about, is it singers, and like you do research on the vagus nerve and how like activating that can result in like an emergent experience too. So like is that a similar idea too with what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a whole area of research that I think is only in its infancy. Like how do we impact the vagus nerve, and also how do these practices impact the vagus nerve? We know the basics, and the basics are really cool and interesting, and worth talking about. But also, who knows in what way that mental state or that experience might be in some way possibly stimulated or something like this. And certainly, if it was the way that my heart and mind were regulating each other, then I imagine some vagal stimulation could have an impact on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just fascinating. I just wanted to jump back because there's so many interesting things you've said along the way. So when you were talking about when you returned to meditation and you felt like you'd like come home, and it makes me think of William Wordsworth, one of his poems, I think Intimations Ode. He talks about how our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. So this idea that like prior to being sort of reaching awareness, we're just like like in this interconnected sort of space that we access through meditation and psychedelics and other emergent practices. So it's so interesting that yeah, like getting into that meditative space is like going home, because it is accessing that sort of collective consciousness. And so yeah, just on your experience, so beautiful too. What's also amazing is I was listening to another podcast where you mentioned it might have been a professor who says we're all bags of stardust, and one of like, yeah, my favorite like quotations is the neuroscientist Christoph Koch, who talks about how, yeah, we're all stardust, and in his discussions about consciousness. But that's kind of it too, hey, how it like brings you to that sort of hyper awareness of, you know, I'm not this single entity, but part of this sort of universal connectedness. So yeah, amazing what you're doing.
Yeah, and how wondrous that is, and that it applies to everything.
Yeah.
So that was actually my Zen teacher at the temple that I lived in Seattle, Genjo Roshi, who said that, and he loves to say that. And at some point, I was reading a book about the gut and kind of what science is known about the gut, which was fascinating to me. And at some point in that book, they were kind of talking about how basically we're like, the whole central core of our body is basically just this tube that in a way it's like outside of our body. It's almost like a donut. And so it's not the inside of our body. And so I, came back to Genjo Roshi and I was like, so bags of stardust, that's really wondrous. But what about like walking tubes of poop? Have you ever thought about it that way? He liked that.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Yeah, so I'm also really interested in how you see your work and research aligning with the EPRC mission and vision. We're just, again, so excited to have you a part of the researchers. And yeah, so what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's kind of transformed over time. And honestly, it's been helpful in the last few years having the EPRC in my life, as I am kind of like, this is what I want to stay aligned with. This is like kind of the core thing to keep coming back to. So formerly, I mentioned the Fulbright research. The Fulbright research, I think, was clearly investigating one perhaps scalable emergent practice, which would be inhaling DMT, with the appropriate setup and supervision. And what ways that actually truly impacts the body and mind. So not just with an idea of, oh, this is good, let's get it out there, let's push it through, but really having a psychotherapist on board for every single session, every step along the way, multiple follow-ups to understand the person's experience. And I actually was also fortunate enough, I was responsible for some of the EEG, the brainwave activity in that project, but because I had done some qualitative research as well, was able to help out the therapists in doing some analysis of their interviews. And so that was quite fascinating and interesting as well. So that's kind of what it looked like before. And other work that I had done before was more in the neuroscience kind of area, although I started getting a little more into phenomenology there too. My work now actually has a kind of different side route, which is also related to the EPRC and kind of ties into the big data project a little bit that the EPRC is working on. So what I'm working at now as part of the team at Quilt, as the head of clinical research, is what we're doing is actually building different classifiers and machine learning algorithms more generally that can give predictions about people's mental state and mental health status according to what's going on their phone. So according to the way that I use my phone, or how much I'm moving around in a given day, things like that can just be passively collected, because frankly, it's annoying if you ask people how they're doing all the time, and we all know that there's issues with self-reporting as well. And so how can we actually measure people's behavior through their phones? And some of that is mobility behavior as well. So there are some ways that emergent practices or meditative or contemplative practices can more directly be tied into there, because there's actually ways that we want to reward people and encourage people with engaging in those practices, which we know are largely beneficial for mental health. However, one of the things that I'm ultimately very interested in about this project is we want ways to classify kind of what experiences people are having in their meditation journeys also, especially as they're diving deeper and deeper. And so if you can track somebody over time, you now have an objective way of potentially tracking and making predictions about where somebody is in, for example, a cycle of insight, and how useful that could be for a person, right? To be able to say, the reason I'm struggling right now so much is actually because of where this last meditation retreat left me off, for example. And most people, even experienced meditators, sometimes don't have really an understanding of what's going on from that perspective. So to have this objective data to help people as they go through these different cycles and mental experiences as they're in a deep meditation practice, for me that's an ultimate area of interest with the project I'm working on right now. Absolutely. At Quilt.
It's so important, and I also liked what you said earlier about, because I also am on antidepressants, but I also meditate, and I think really important that you acknowledge, like this sort of multidisciplinary approach where you're looking at mental health issues, but again, giving people different options. It's like you're talking about the different perspectives and everything too, and how key that is for someone who's coping with that sort of thing. And also this idea of just being aware that there's like a possible brain state, and then in being aware that is possible, just that giving you hope to sort of get out of these really tricky states as well, and then that sort of mental superpower that you eventually gain by just again being able to move between states of despair and joy and equanimity and all these movements that really shows, and then getting to see that again like from the neuroscience perspective, what's going on in the brain too is so fascinating. So do you think that like that's part of it too, this idea of like having faith, and then therefore does that kind of tie in faith and neuroscience and spirituality in a sense? Like, do you find them working together?
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's an amazing question. So first I just want to touch briefly on what you said about knowing that there's some kind of brain state and things that are happening in your brain, just that alone being transformative, and that they can change. When I worked for about 2 years at a retreat center that was basically combining different neuroscience tech with meditative practices, saw some very interesting things during that time. But one of the most interesting things to notice of other people was they were there for the transformation, of course, and they were there to have certain experiences, but often one of the most cathartic experiences for people was coming in after that initial scan that I did or my colleague did, and kind of explaining to them, hey, here's what this might be indicating, and here's what we're seeing in your brain, here's what it might mean. Just that alone, having an understanding of like, oh, this part of my life or my experience is actually in my brain as well. This might be something hard or it might be something joyous. That in its own is kind of liberating. And then to go the next step and say, and we can change this and mold it as you please, is pretty spectacular. It really opens things up. Yeah. The conversation about faith and science and free will is fascinating, and especially as it relates to meditation practice. And if you think about meditation practices, not all are this way, but they could be considered a kind of first-person science. And so, going through this first-person science inquiry, project, research study, you might come upon this experience and reality, which is true, that you don't have any free will. Yeah. And I think that is true, and it's quite liberating also. But people also get stuck there, right? That's actually just a lens, like we were talking about before. And so that's one lens, and if you don't know how to pick up that lens, you're at a deficit, you're at a loss, because if you only have the will lens, the free will lens, it's a kind of trap, and it's a very painful place, because it's also quite easy to judge yourself and hate yourself in those circumstances. And so once you learn to take that off and put on this other lens of, oh, there's no free will, things are just happening, they're flowing.
Yeah.
That's really, really important, and it's an important part of the kind of meditative journey, certainly in the Buddhist tradition. But it's not the end of the meditative journey, because then you need to figure out, how do I take that back off?
Yep.
And there's times when it's actually quite appropriate to say, no, I have free will. This morning when I woke up, I said, what kind of tea do I want to have this morning? I said, I'm going to have that black tea that I just got. I'm excited about that. I had to make a choice about that on some level.
Yeah.
Now, the more you zoom out, you might say, okay, well, who's making the choice and what's responsible for making the choice? Those are all true, but again, that's just, you're picking the other lens back up. When people cling to no free will as reality, it means that they're clinging to a reality, which means they've totally missed it.
Yes.
And so it has to be fluid and transient, and in each moment there's an appropriate answer to whether there's free will or there's not free will. And so each moment, the appropriate answer is our response. So I think there is a faith that we have to have, that like, I have to choose certain things, the teapot doesn't fill itself. And also there's a very nice benefit from being able to lean back into giving that up as well.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah, thank you. It's always good to get your perspective on, I have way too many interests, and then everything that I'm interested in, you're also interested in. So it's really fun to get to chat with you about all of it. I also know, among all the other things you do, you're a student of Rinzai Zen. Do you mind talking about that as well, and sort of various experiences related to that?
Absolutely. So I'll just say briefly, I left off the meditation journey that we talked about a little bit earlier with, I started going deeper and deeper, and I was looking for a practice. At a certain moment, actually, that same figure who gave me that hug and I felt this unconditional love, that same person was like, hey, your meditation practice is just a proxy for your perfectionism. And she was a meditator, by the way. So she wasn't saying, you should stop meditating. But I heard that and I thought, oh my God, she's right. I need to stop. So I stopped meditating for a few months. And at somewhere along the way, I was staying with some family friends, and they were like, oh, you're doing stuff related to meditation. Our daughter-in-law, she goes to a Zen center that's pretty close by to where you live. Why don't you go check it out with her? And I was about this close to saying, nah, I'm good. I'm taking a break from that stuff. But I just, probably out of being polite, I was like, all right, sure, I'll go with her. And basically wandered into that temple one morning in Seattle, Choboji Temple, and was, again, just struck with this, oh, this is it. This is what I was looking for years at that point. The tradition that I wanted to root down in and go a little deeper in. So what is Rinzai Zen about? So a lot of people hear about Zen, and it's perhaps one of the most unused or misused words, I should say, in the English vernacular. But Zen, Zen is a Japanese word, but it actually comes from this word that we often discuss in the EPRC and certainly in Daniel's book, which is jhana, which are these kind of deep meditative absorbed states. And so jhana, going to China, became Chan. And that's actually how it's pronounced now in Han China, but probably at the time in southern China, the pronunciation was more similar to Zen. And then at a certain point it went over to Japan and it became the word Zen. And so this tradition is really the tradition of seated meditation dedicated to deep absorption. And knowing the intensity and especially the militarism of parts of Japanese culture, it's a meditative absorption at all costs. So it's very intense, and the kind of structure of it can be quite rigid. So that involves kind of long hours of sitting and kind of strict rules about you don't move while you're sitting, and certain forms and traditions that are more kind of Japanese or Chinese in nature. there's a lot of the Buddhist tradition that comes through in this, and it is called Zen Buddhism, but also there's a lot of Taoism that comes into it as well, which was kind of the existing prolific school of religious tradition in China at that time when Buddhism arrived. And so these kind of got wedded, and one of the results was the Zen tradition. So what is the Rinzai Zen tradition? Well, there's a specific Zen master in 8th or 9th century China whose name in Chinese was Linji, and in Japanese would be pronounced more Rinzai. And so that became the name of this school. And hilariously, he was known for like shouting and hitting people as his way of helping people wake up. I don't think that that probably wouldn't work today. Probably would lead most of us, certainly myself, into a deeper, darker place and not necessarily in the direction of insight. But at the time, in his circumstances, it was appropriate. One of the cornerstones of this tradition, though, is it's relying on koans. And actually, before I get to koans, I'd just like to say, really, one of the ways that I look at it, so my teacher, Genjo Roshi, who I mentioned, and Rinzan Osho here in Portland, one thing that they like to say, and particularly Genjo says, Zen is the religion of not knowing. Zen is the religion of not knowing. And so when we go back to those lenses that we were talking about earlier, Zen is really the religion of, and the practice of taking the lenses off, not putting another lens on. And naturally, when you take it off, you take these lenses off, you get to deeper and deeper lenses, one after the next. And that's wondrous. And sometimes, a lens will come on, and you're like, wow, I never saw the world this way. This is incredible. And the natural inclination is to say, I've seen the truth. And this is the true reality. And what the Zen tradition says is, just keep taking the lenses off. Just keep going for it. You did great, and you had a really nice experience, and that was important, and you should just keep going. Keep taking the lenses off.
Yeah.
So the core of Zen practice is about that. It's about learning to take our lenses off. And you might think of your lens as not only the way that you cognitively look at the world, but also all of your reactions, your fundamental reactions to things that are happening in your own body and mind and what you perceive to be happening outside, taking all of those off and getting further and further out or in, let's say, towards the core of just what's happening here when you take all the lenses off, before putting any judgment or thought into it. So once you start getting proficient at taking those lenses off, one of the really cool things that we do in the Rinzai Zen tradition is actually then we learn to pick up new lenses. And so this is a very interesting and I think unique form of practice in our tradition, which is we have these tools that we call koans. And a koan, that word actually basically just means like public mandate or like a recording of a public episode, something like that. Doesn't mean much, but what they almost always are is an exchange either between a teacher and a student or between two practitioners. And often they might be having a conversation about the reality of the world or a meditation practice or just what they're experiencing. Could be heartfelt. And sometimes it could just be a word. There are certain koans that are just a single word. And so whatever the koan is, that's the lens that you're asked to put on. So it's assumed, okay, you're proficient at taking your lenses off, and you've taken off enough lenses to put on the lens that this koan is asking you to put on. And when you put it on, what's the world that you see? And what's the world that you see with your body, more importantly? What's the experience that you're having? And this can just be such a profound tool to show us different sides and lessons that are important for us to learn.
Yeah, it teaches you. We talked about this. Both of us presented at Google's. It was a GPAUSE series through Nicholas Whitaker and friend of ours, Lauren DeCray, who helps run the EPRC's Poetry and Emergence group, which Sam has also joined. Sam was talking about koans there and did a guided meditation. And I remember you talking to about the value of being in uncertainty and not grasping for meaning and not grasping for truth, but just being comfortable in that state, and sort of realizing that's where we're at our most like creative. There's David Eagleman and Bo Lotto, so both neuroscientists, and also looked at like the neuroscience of that value of uncertainty and how powerful that can be for us. So that is it too, just kind of getting to sit in that uncertainty and not try to like just grasp at knowledge and understand, but kind of be in it then. Yeah.
In the Zen tradition, there's kind of 3 pillars that we say for practice, and Buddhism has its own various pillars that are supportive of practice or mindfulness, lots of lists in all of these traditions. So in Zen, it's kind of, we have these 3 pillars, and one is great determination, and that kind of makes sense to us. Meditation isn't always easy, especially if you're having a kind of deep committed practice, and so naturally determination is quite important. Another is faith, which is an interesting topic, and I maybe won't go into it fully now, because what I really wanted to talk about is actually the 3rd pillar, which is the great doubt. And so this great doubt or uncertainty or unknown, it's cognitive uncertainty, certainly. So it is the state of like, I don't know anything, I don't even really know who I am. And I don't even know exactly what I'm doing when I sit down and do meditation, and yet it happens, and my mind collects itself. So there's that level, which is more cognitive, and then there's the kind of deeper levels of not just uncertainty or unknowing that we can wrap our heads around, but actually this level of unworking our fundamental assumptions or behavioral patterns around how we interact with things. And that actually, so when you have this cognitive level of uncertainty, it can be quite uncomfortable, and it's very important to train that. It's a useful skill, like you're saying. But once you drop lower, first of all, you can have very uncomfortable experiences, certainly, but you also, this is where the really cool, joyous, weird stuff happens as well. This is where you can walk outside and see the same oak tree that you've seen every day for a year and be almost in tears with how marvelous and how detailed and spectacular that life is that's coming out of the ground. Those are also the kinds of experiences that you can be able to have when you give up your idea of knowing stuff.
Yes. And so does that go along
and it's only possible, yeah.
Yeah, does that go along with like dissolving your ego then? Like do you have to kind of, because there's always talk about that loss of self, but then simultaneously there's also this idea of like understanding, cultivating the self, and so is that like a hard sort of dichotomy between you want to kind of lose the self in order to really connect and see things, but also the necessity of an individual self?
Yeah, I think it goes both ways, but absolutely you're right. Like, that is the experience of dropping yourself. That is the experience of yourself dropping away, and what a wondrous experience it is. It's so freeing and so wonderful, and everything shines and is brilliant. And so, yes, and like you're saying, we don't get to stay in the acute kind of peak of this realization all the time. And so coming back and using that to help us build a healthy sense of self is really important. To recognize that there is both no self and there's the self. They're both true, actually, and neither are true, in fact, as well. So that is so important, and actually it can be quite important for us to first build a healthy sense of self, whether through therapy or other modalities, before even engaging deeply in meditation practice. Some of us don't do that, and we just engage deeply first, and then we have to figure it out along the way as well. So that happens too, but critically, I think we do need to, A, be able to have a healthy sense of self walking around, and B, this can be supported by being able to drop our sense of self, or I won't even say being able to, maybe if you get to Daniel's level, it's being able to, but having the experience of
Yes.
dropping your sense of self.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. And it's, just knowing that it exists, but not having to always be in that state, but learning from it and then having that change how you act in the world as a self is so key. Yeah, absolutely. And then I guess for the final question is, the two parts, what brings you the most joy and meaning in your work and research? And B, I know that like one of your goals is to really help people live healthier, happier lives, which is also one of the goals of the EPRC, this human flourishing through sort of different perspectives on health and integrating the clinical perspective and the spiritual and the scientific. So most meaning, and then how you see your work sort of bringing about change for people at the individual and societal level.
Yeah. Probably the most meaningful part of my work is seeing people's faces light up. And I don't get to do that all that much, especially in my capacity now. I'm mostly setting systems up. And so I have to also imagine people's faces lighting up and know that, this is actually helping bring people back into touch with what's going on with them, which is actually the whole goal of the Quilt kind of app and solution that I'm working on right now. But even in my kind of practice and life as a meditation instructor and facilitator, seeing people's faces light up as they become free of something that's been a monkey on their back or that's been plaguing them. I don't think there's anything that's as rewarding and happy and joyous as that. So there's that, and also certainly getting the chance to see that in people's psychedelic experiences during research. What was your second question?
Yeah, and then how you see like your work specifically bringing about like sort of individual change and helping people sort of live happier, more fulfilling lives.
Right. Yeah, in terms of how the work that I have been doing or will continue to do has an impact on people flourishing, I would say the word that's really been coming up for me recently in the last few months is agency. And I think that's a really funny word given the conversation that we're having and given that there's a core truth of this tradition that I hold dear, which is that there's no free will. And that's a core truth that we find. And that, again, as we mentioned, it is true. And also, how do you look at agency within that lens? Well, for me, agency is the ability to do what's most helpful at any given time. Because if you're not doing what's most helpful, you're certainly not choosing, right? You've in some way been coerced by your own mind to do something that's not as helpful, and you might perceive that you have choice to make that choice, but you're being pulled in some way. And so the only choice to make, really, if you're truly free, is the one that's helpful and the one that's kind to yourself and others. And so I think the goal of my work, whether it be in the diabetes community or in research or with this Quilt app that's helping people understand where they're at, is just to bring this agency back. So you can say, okay, now that I have as best of information as I can about my current experience, what now? What now?
And where do you see, I guess maybe this is where we'll jump off, is sort of with the app, like what would be your ideal scenario with it when it's all ready and you have it out there? What would be your ideal result?
Yeah, well, when we launch in a few months, I think the initial idea is we want to give people a better idea of where they're at and what ways they can better support their mental health. So maybe it's spending less time on your phone at night, or maybe it's getting outside your house a little bit more. Things as simple as that. So for the individual, that's kind of what we're interested in. And then we're also really interested in, for like clinicians, for providers, for example, that person's psychiatrist or psychologist, we want them to have a better sense of what's going on with this person, what's going on with my patient, and how can I help them better. A lot of the times you can pick up early warning signs in these kind of mobile sensing data streams that can then allow a clinician to intervene so that somebody doesn't end up in a hospital, for example, or somebody doesn't develop a comorbidity like addiction or unhealthy eating habits or something like this. So these are things that can be avoided if we pull people out of hot water sooner. And the only way we can do that is to know whether they're in hot water. So I think that's the kind of short-term heart connection piece of why I care and what we want out of this. And then the longer term is to do that on a broad scale, so that everybody can have a better sense of, hey, where am I really at right now? I think I know how I feel, but like, what's really going on with me behaviorally? And maybe how is that related to my meditation practice or other things that I'm doing? And what does it mean for how I go about in the world? Maybe there's a better way to do this based on where I am right now.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, we're, again, so lucky to have you as part of the EPRC. It's been such a joy to talk to you.
Shot